Hello and welcome to the Literature Life. Today I am going to discuss the essay Indian Literature Notes on the Definition of a Category by Aijaz Ahmad. The essay was published as a chapter in Ahmad's book called In Theory in 1992 and the book was published by Verso. The essay is highly acknowledged and widely included in various university curricula. It is clear from the fact that Verso has published this, and Verso only publishes highly distinguished work from people who are really saying something solid, something that is different from all the mainstream thinkers of the time. The essay has 9 sections and it goes on for 40 pages. So I have decided that I am going to make one video for each section. This will keep all the videos in this 9 lecture series short and crisp. Plus, if you're having a problem with a particular part of the essay and don't want to watch the entire thing, you can go directly to the relevant section and save some time. I am not introducing Aijaz Ahmad here because I've done that in my previous videos on his essay, The Politics of Literary Post-Coloniality, and I wanted to keep this one very short for you. However, you need to know this much, that Ahmad applies a Marxist perspective to post-colonial studies. He critiques established post-colonial critics like Homi, Bhabha, Gayatri, Spivak, Fredric, Jameson and Edward Said for ignoring the material aspect, the material conditions, the real ground situations and aftermaths created by the colonial exploitation. So these thinkers, Ahmad says, they talk about a third world or Indian literature in a very textual manner without really getting into the material conditions. In the present essay, Ahmad criticizes the Western academia for trying to theorize about a third world literature or Indian literature. He condemns the Western critics for trying to generate generalized knowledge, theoretical knowledge about a third world literature or an Indian literature without really knowing the history, without really considering the complexities of such categories, of such work. They talk as if these categories are very neatly organized, very well defined, kind of unified, coherent and homogeneous, which is not the case. So, Ahmad mentions the difficulties in assuming such homogeneous categories. He mentions the problematic consequences of homogenizing diverse works into fixed headings like third world literature or Indian literature. He also mentions the conditions that certain literary works should possess in order to be a part of a bigger literature, of a larger literature, body of literature. In the whole essay, Ahmad advocates for a more interrelated or more comparative study of works of literature, and he denounces and attacks the tendency to huddle and bunch together diverse, different, heterogeneous works coming from separate cultures and languages and call them third world literature or Indian literature. This is the crux of this introductory part, the unit 1 of this essay. So in order to keep this video short and interesting, I'm not going to read the text of the essay. I'll display the section I'm discussing on the screen and you can use your copy of the text and you can pause and read what's on the screen or in your text and then correspond it with what I'm speaking so you understand the whole thing. Alright, so let's get to the essay. Indian Literature Notes Towards the Definition of a Category. This is the title of the essay and you need to observe 2 things about it. Number 1, the words Indian literature are in inverted commas. This suggests that Ahmad is not endorsing this category. He does not believe in a category called Indian literature, so he is using inverted commas to tell you that he is using the term as the Western thinkers use it. Alright, as if it is a fixed category, and hence he uses the inverted commas as if he is just using air quotes and rolling his eyes and frowning at the Western academia for using this term in such a fixed manner. The second thing is the word notes. This word suggests that the essay is made up of Ahmad's notes, his points, his difficulties and his hopes in defining such a category. So he is making notes of the problems the problems that one can face while defining the category called Indian literature. The category cannot be defined so easily. There are problems to the category, and Aijaz Ahmad makes notes on those problems, and this essay is a culmination of it. So, the title becomes suggestive of what is to come in the essay. The difficulties in categorizing diverse works into a single category, and also the suggestions he gives as to how certain works of literature actually do form a larger literature, but it is not based on the simplistic factors that the West uses for such categorization. So now I move on to the text, and this is the first section which I am going to discuss. I request you open your texts and bring this section in front of you. Right at the opening of the essay, you can pause and read that Ahmad lists 4 problems, 4 difficulties with constructing a theoretical category called Third World Literature. And what is a theoretical category? A theoretical category is a category that is so well developed, that is so neatly defined, so well organized, which is a category which is made up of such well connected and similar themed works that it is possible to use such categories to base theoretical insights. Now you can derive theoretical generalizations from such category. Now you can base your abstract knowledge about a bigger thing based on this category, right? So he says that there are 4 problems with the theoretical category called Third World Literature. What is the first problem? The theoretical category of Third World Literature has a cavalier way with history. What does it mean? What is a cavalier way with history? It means that people, the Western thinkers, the Western critics who hurriedly assume, without much deep thought, who assume a theoretical category called Third World Literature, they generally do not understand, nor they care to put in the effort to understand the diverse, complex histories of the works that, according to them, form such a category. So they have a cavalier way, they have a very indifferent, a very casual way with the history of these areas and the history of these works which they huddle together as a category called Third World Literature. That's the first problem, their cavalier way with history. What is the second problem? Homogenization of a prolix and variegated archive which is little understood and then hurriedly categorized. So Ahmad has a second problem, that when scholars study these multifarious different works under a fixed heading called Third World Literature or Indian literature, what do these scholars do? They homogenize. They assume a common ground which is rather simplistic and not very well understood. They hastily, in a very quick manner, without much thought to the details, rush so many different works together and call them Third World Literature. They categorize them, which is not appropriate. So this is coming from a particular region, let's call it Indian literature. This is coming from a particular underdeveloped country, let's call it Third World Literature. So they take very simplistic grounds to create categories, which is not right. How categories can be created, Ahmad discusses it later, but this is not the way to do it, that is for sure. The third problem Ahmad mentions is an equally homogenizing impulse to slot very diverse kinds of public aspirations under the unitary insignia of nationalism, and then to designate this nationalism as the determinant and epochal ideology for cultural production in non-Western societies. Now, I'm sure that this is a very intimidating sentence, but do not worry, it's very simple. What it means is that when the West talks about the third world, a third world, they have a tendency to think that all the works produced in these countries are a result of nationalism, as if apart from nationalism there was no other ambition, there was no other mission or movement, there was no other important emotion in these countries, as if there were no conflicts in those areas on the basis of class or gender or caste or religion. They consider nationalism as a determinate and epochal ideology. Determinate, which determines everything, and epochal ideology is the ideology of the whole epoch, of the whole age. This is what they consider. that nationalism was the only emotion in those countries, which is not the case. And whatever cultural texts are produced in those areas, they are considered as a result of only and only a nationalist feeling. This is not what happens, right? All the works produced in the media, literature, arts are considered as a result of nationalism by these scholars, as if no other force, no other factor, no other ideology, no other issue than the issue of nationalism was a factor in these productions, in these works of media, literature, arts, cultural productions of that time. Nationalism is thus understood as the determinant and epochal ideology. This is not actually how things shaped in these countries, and therefore Ahmad wants to point this out. That was the third problem. What's the fourth problem? Its propensity to inflate the choice of immigration into a rhetoric of exile, and then to contrive this inflation as the mediating term between the third and the first world. Now, what does this mean? I read this from the text. When people of the third world countries decide to move out of their home countries for whatever reasons, it is looked at by the first world countries not as a matter of their choice, but as a form of forced exile, a form of uprooting, marked with subtle undertones of suffering on account of that exile. And then this rhetoric of exile becomes the only mediating term, the only relationship between the third world and the first, which is not the case. You know that people move out of their countries by their own choice sometimes, and many times perhaps. The first and the so-called third world interact with each other in so many other ways than this exile relationship. When the West theorizes about a third world, the emigrant appears as a refugee. The person who's moving out of a third world country appears as a refugee, and the West appears as an asylum. A power play suddenly comes into action. The third world citizen immediately appears vulnerable because of this rhetoric of exile, and he appears as if he's seeking shelter, and the West immediately appears as the higher power, as the shelter provider, as the superior location, where in real life, in so many cases, the West actually invites people from the third world, maybe for the lack of skill in their own country, or maybe for the generation of income on account of foreign students studying in their country. For tourism, they may invite people from third world countries. For capital investment, and for so many other reasons where the first world invites the people from third world countries, and it is not exile. Exile is not always the only mediating term between the third world and the first world, so this is also a problem. In the following lines, Ahmad uses a quote from the author D.D. Kosambi. I hope you can locate it in your text. It's the end of this paragraph. D.D. Kosambi was reviewing a book in which he wrote that the desire to profit without labor or learning the technique is a feature of Indian research, which is like a backward bourgeoisie or a backward middle class. So, simply stating, D.D. Kosambi was saying that it is very typical of Indian research, like the Indian middle class, where people want to profit without putting in the hard work, without learning the technique. While Kosambi uses this for the kind of research that goes on in India, Ahmad here in these lines says that this is ironically a feature of the Western academia, which without putting in the labor, without putting in the hard work, without getting the grasp of techniques, without getting the grasp of the complexity of their subject matter, the Western academia tries in a rushed manner to categorize so many diverse works and journeys and aspirations and emotions into one category, one fixed category called third world literature. It is the West that acts like a backward bourgeoisie and tries to categorize something that cannot be categorized so simply. Alright, so in the next lines, which are displayed on the screen now, you can pause and take a look. Ahmad points out that forget about a third world literature which extends into 3 continents, namely Asia, Africa and Latin America. That's what the third world comprises of according to the Western world. He says, forget about such a vast area. He cannot even speak about a coherent category, a unified category called Indian literature. So in this essay, he will not try to pose a third world literature or an Indian literature. That's not his purpose. What he will try to do? He will just try to list out the difficulties one has in constructing such categories, especially the category of Indian literature. So with the lines displayed on the screen, he says that adding up all the literatures of the various hugely different states of a diverse country like India will not give you a unified entity called Indian literature. Their histories and literatures may be adjacent, they occurred at the same time, but yet they are very discrete, very different from each other and cannot be added up as an archive called Indian literature. If one combines the history of Tamil literature with Gujarati literature, with Punjabi literature, with perhaps the literature from Mizoram or the literature from Andaman and Nicobar Islands, well, they are all part of an Indian literature, but they cannot be studied together because they are not connected in any manner. So their histories are adjacent, they occurred side by side, but they are discrete, they are separate, not really connected in an organic way to make a coherent body of literature, a coherent history of a thing called Indian literature. So Ahmad says, if you add up all constituent parts of a country's literature, it does not make a national literature. They are parts, they happen side by side, but they are very different and therefore cannot be huddled together as a national literature. Okay. So in the next section displayed on the screen, take a pause, have a look. In the next section, Ahmad says that when one cannot add up the constituent parts of various literatures in India and cannot arrive at a thing called Indian literature, which is comparatively lesser area than the so-called third world literature, how can one add up the literatures of so many different and diverse countries and so many different and diverse and numerous cultures and create a thing called third world literature? This is just not right. All countries, cultures, people are so diverse. Just by finding a quick common ground, a hurried common ground, a hasty common ground of location or economic underdevelopment or vague history of colonization, by finding common grounds like this, which are factors which so-called third world countries may share, one cannot group together all such diverse entities and call it part of a third world literature. One cannot rush together their cultural productions and call it a third world literature. This is a very straightforward, very mainstream, a very simplistic way of looking at history. Okay. So next section for you on the screen, please take a pause, have a look. Ahmad says in these lines that there are certain gaps in our knowledge about these categories. We still have to know these categories well and know them in all their depth and complexity. But that's true, there are gaps, but there are bigger problems than the gaps. What are the bigger problems? Number one, the process of colonial domination not just only alters the history of the time of colonial rule, but also the history of the time before the colonial rule. So how we look at the things before the colonial rule is also changed. The colonial domination that was imposed on us has changed us in a way that people look differently not only on the things during the colonial process but also before the colonial process. For example, how we look at the Indian scriptures, the Vedas and the other scriptures, how we look at the classical literatures of the colonized countries, both of which were produced before the colonial process, is also changed by the colonial process. How is this true? Ahmad will prove in the subsequent part of the essay, and we'll take it from there. The second problem is that cultural productions like the works of art and literature and media produced in a particular culture, these cultural productions cannot be contained They cannot be easily organized according to the boundaries set by the colonial rulers and their policies. Okay, so what is being written in Karnataka, for example, does not absolutely stop at the border of Karnataka. It may impact what is written in Andhra Pradesh, which shares a border with it. This is also true of how languages impact each other regardless of the state boundaries. For example, before and during the colonial process, Urdu impacted Hindi. So, there's a difference between how the West understands the concept of state boundaries and how literature actually gets shaped, regardless of state boundaries in countries like India, where there are so many languages and so many cultures. If you did not understand the couple of sentences that I just spoke, do not worry. This point is explained in great detail later on within this section only. Okay. So, when it comes to literature and language and culture, Ahmad insists that boundaries are fluid. Literature and language cross boundaries defined by the colonial state. So, since the histories within the Indian country or within the third world are not histories as the West understands them, so the mainstream scholars who do not understand this feature are not really qualified to theorize about a third world history or an Indian literary history. What they produce is a very simplistic version of history of these regions based on state boundaries and linguistic boundaries which are not actually boundaries, and in reality, in material conditions, these boundaries actually cross each other. And therefore, when someone tries to theorize about Indian literature or third world literature, or tries to create a unified narrative about the history of Indian literature or third world literature, as if these categories are made up of neat, organized, continuous, similar histories, such histories are simply not available. One cannot club together such diverse histories of literatures of so many small regions, of so many small states, of so many countries, of the 3 colonized continents, and call it a history of third world literature. Such a history is simply not available because it is based on factors which are not materially there, which are not materially true. They are only textually true. Only the Western scholars can assume that these boundaries hold true. They can only assume that languages change according to borders, but in reality that's not what happens. So the history that they have assumed is not actually true, is not actually there. So their theorization about such literatures becomes wrong because it is based on a history which is not actually the right history. In the next section, which is displayed on your screen, please pause and have a read so that you can understand what I am going to say. In this section, Ahmad says, you can actually call some works as forming a certain category of literature when all these works appear to be shaped by a culture as a whole. When all these works can be studied in relationship to the culture of which they are a part and the culture that they have shaped. In other words, these works share an organic relationship to the culture as a whole. They shape the culture they are produced in, and in turn they are shaped by the culture they are produced in. Alright? These works may be spread across state boundaries, they may have crossed all language barriers, but can still be studied as a part of a larger literature. Take the example of Bhakti literature. The Bhakti movement started in Tamil Nadu. In fact, it started in the south of India without you really regarding state boundaries, right? It originated in south of India, which is now called Tamil Nadu. It originated with Tamil language and literature in the 6th century. It was a spiritual movement that spread in the form of devotional poetry, right? By the 15th century, the Bhakti movement had spread regardless of state boundaries and language barriers and had taken a different shape in Telugu and Kannada literature. So now writers from what we now call Telangana and Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka, writers were forming Bhakti poetry, were creating Bhakti poetry in these states as well. So much so that Bhakti movement impacted the culture and literature of even North India. Now writers writing in Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, Bengali and even Punjabi were creating Bhakti poetry. Writers ranging from Tulsidas, Surdas, Mirabai, Kabir Das to Guru Nanak Dev Ji and Jayadeva. There are so many others in North India who were now creating Bhakti poetry. Alright, so Bhakti poetry that originated from Tamil Nadu crossed all boundaries, crossed all language barriers and still remained Bhakti poetry. The organic thread of the Bhakti element remained from Tamil Nadu to the north of India. Such works, all the works pertaining to Bhakti literature, despite the regional and linguistic differences, still form part of a larger literature called the Bhakti literature. The works produced in this manner may be studied in relation to the culture as a whole, right? The Bhakti literature shaped the culture across state boundaries, across linguistic boundaries, and Bhakti literature was in turn shaped by the cultures of these various states and these various languages despite all the state and language boundaries, all right? Then when a literature develops like this, then we can base our theoretical generalization on such literature because it is not based on straightforward or simplistic factors such as shift in language, shift in region, shift in time period or empire. These are the simplistic factors, but literatures like the Bhakti literature are not based on such simplistic factors. It is based on the manner in which the literature and the culture is organically related despite all the differences. That was the first factor that works need to possess in order to be called a part of a larger literature. The second is that when works are related like this, organically related to the culture, maybe studied in relationship to this culture in which they were produced, then periodization comes to rest on shifts more fundamental than mere breaks in chronology. This is Aijaz Ahmad's words. I am reading it from the text. Ahmad says that if we group the works according to their organic relationship with the culture as a whole, their periodization, their deciding of various periods will rest on shifts that are more fundamental in nature than mere breaks in chronology. We have seen that usually when they periodize literature, it is usually based on the basis of some shifts. Sometimes when the monarchy changes, we change the period of literature such as Elizabethan literature, Victorian literature. Sometimes we just study it as 18th century literature, 19th century literature. This is periodization based on time period. Alright, so this is how it's done. But Ahmad says that the periodization should not be based on such simplistic shifts in chronology. Literature doesn't actually change exactly at the turn of a century. It does not change exactly with the chronology. The features do not change overnight just because the time period has changed from 2000 to 2001 or the monarch has changed. So mere breaks in chronology should not be taken as the basis of periodization. So we should not huddle some works of literature together and give it a name just because it was written over a certain period of time. This way of periodization is not correct. On the other hand, when some works of literature are shaped by a culture as a whole, like the example I just gave about Bhakti literature, one can study these works to understand the shifts on which the periodization of this literature is based. What were the different phases of such literature? What factors made one phase develop into the other? The factors for these shifts could be political, it could be economical, it could be religious. These shifts will decide the periodization of such works into different groups. The shifts in such trends are more fundamental than mere chronological breaks, mere shift in the time period that we generally use to periodize literature. So you see how these works go on sharing a very organic relationship with each other and reflect the things happening in the culture and the society. So Ahmad says that this is a very productive way of approaching works of literature and grouping them under a heading. The third factor that such works should have is that they are able to account for the dominance of the major generic forms and their uneven developments in terms of periods or region. So when works are grouped together on the basis of their relationship with their culture, and when their periodization comes to rest on shifts more fundamental than mere chronology, the two factors that we just read, it becomes possible to study why some genres became successful and why some of them did not. Studying works like this will reflect, for example, why the Bhakti poetry spread more rapidly in the second millennium, right? The genre of Bhakti poetry spread more rapidly in the second millennium. Some scholars say that it was due to the arrival of Islam in India. So they spread Bhakti poetry even more vehemently to keep the spirit alive, right? So the thriving of one genre could be studied in relation to this political and religious shift. Similarly, the rise of Bhakti poetry was also one of the reasons of the spread of Sufi poetry and Sufism in the Islamic sects. So you see how we can, by studying Bhakti poetry, by studying Bhakti literature, we get to see why some genres thrived, why some genres became successful, and why some of them could not rise so quickly. You see how we can study the rise and fall of some works in relation to the culture as a whole. Whereas if you group together works based on shifts in chronology or other simplistic factors like regions, such details are nowhere reflected. The fourth thing that happens when you group together works according to their culture, material conditions for the subordination of other generic forms in the course of historical development is also reflected. This was from the text. So it should also be, these works which we are grouping together should also be able to explain what were the material conditions that allowed the thriving of one genre over another. So we have already discussed that. In the next section, Ahmad reiterates the same point that these things can happen across regions, they can happen across linguistic and geographical boundaries, and are not restricted by the state boundaries imposed on us by the colonial process. He says that the rise of print capitalism might have affected this. It means that, for example, the books written in Bengali are usually, through print capitalism, are usually circulated only in regions of West Bengal or regions around it. So it has created linguistic sections, it has spread some languages in particular borders, that's true, but it has not changed entirely. Still in India, literature keeps getting affected by other cultures and other languages and other regions, all right? The next section is on the screen. Please give it a read. So in this section, Ahmad says that there are many problems in assuming a category called Indian literature. The basic problems which everybody knows is that, number one, India is spread over so many languages and so many regions, and every language and region has a history of its own, and the history has developed very unevenly. So it cannot be studied so easily and in a unified way. Second, we know that in India, state boundaries keep shifting. States keep dividing, states keep unifying, and the boundaries don't stay stable. So when there are no stable boundaries, the histories that were true earlier were now changed. So there's a problem in creating a category called Indian literature. But there are bigger problems in assuming such a category. The main problem is that the factors on which the writing of history has been done, the main basis on which the selection of works which were considered a part of history was done, these factors are skewed, they are biased, they are exclusive. It means that those who were narrativizing, those who were writing that history and selecting works and selecting features were usually biased towards those in power. They usually favored those in power. History is generally written from points of view that, and Ahmad mentions three things about this, that history has been written in a way that has privileged high textuality of a Brahminical kind to posit the unification of its literary history. It is from the text. So Ahmad says that although many other literatures also existed at that time, only those texts were selected in the history of so-called Indian literature which were Brahminical in nature, which were of the high literature type. Works, stories, narratives, anecdotes that were not of the high literary kind and were not Brahminical in nature were ignored and were not included in the canon, so were removed from history. Second, the second factor is that these works and these histories, they assembled the history of main texts of particular languages in a very uneven way to obtain this unity through the aggregative principle. They just wanted to obtain the history of an Indian literature. So what they did, they only included the history of the main texts of some languages and ignored texts that were marginal, were obscure, difficult to understand, difficult to really include. So texts that were radical, the texts that were unconventional or belonged to the languages that were not considered mainstream, these kind of texts were excluded. So the history of Indian literature that comes down to us is not very inclusive, is not based on an even selection of works and did not privilege all languages and all kinds of works equally. That's the second problem why there can't be an Indian literature because or the history of an Indian literature. The third problem is that such historians attempted to reconstruct the cross-fertilization, I'm reading this from the text, attempted to reconstruct the cross-fertilization of genres and themes in several languages, but with highly idealistic emphasis and with the canonizing procedures of the great books variety, with scant attempt to locate literary history within other sorts of histories in any consistent fashion. Now, what this long sentence means is that such history, the mainstream history that we're talking about, it selected works with highly idealistic emphasis. Like there was a paradigm for perfect works, they selected those. Works that failed to meet the definition of high literature were ignored. Works were selected with the canonizing procedures of the great books variety. Only the works that fit the paradigm, only the books that fit the definition of great books according to them were picked and included in the canon. No attempt was made to locate literary history within other marginal, irregular and unconventional kinds of texts, right? So what Ahmad means here is that the history of the category called Indian literature that comes to us is simply not right because there have been gaps. And what are the gaps? That the basis on which works were selected for this category called Indian literature were all random. They all favored those who were in power. Books were selected from many languages in an uneven manner. Many books were selected from a particular languages, while too few were selected from some other language, perhaps none from a marginal language. Also, the process of selection favored high literature and works that did not qualify were excluded. So what comes to us is a sort of manipulated history that favors some classes while excludes some other classes. Such history favors some languages while excludes some other languages. This is just a glimpse of the kind of problems Ahmad is going to pose here in this essay, and he will prove that a well-defined category called Indian literature is a flawed prospect, is not really possible yet. The next section is on your screens now. In this section, Ahmad declares that he will discuss the above in the essay. He also states that it is not entirely impossible to speak of an Indian history which is not manipulated or which is not simplistic like the above histories he talked about. And Indian history that is not just the history based on simplistic or chronological shifts like change of rulers, empires and religions, or the developments in sectors or geographical regions is actually possible, and Ahmad will show you this in the essay. Okay, so where is this work? In the next section, which is visible on your screen right now. This is the text from the essay. So Ahmad continues that it is possible to speak of a history of Indian literature which is not based on very simplistic and flawed and manipulative factors. Many Marxist historians, according to Ahmad, have written about an Indian history in which periodization is done not on the basis of chronological shifts but regarding the main forms of production and property. Chronological shifts are based on two factors called production and property. The trends in particular time period regarding the cultural and material production and the trends in the ownership and division and use of property defines what kind of history that is. It is not based on chronological shifts. These Marxist critics have not deliberately favored any time period or regions while excluding others like the earlier historians had done. Although there are gaps and disagreements among these critics as well, still their version of Indian history is much more careful, much more inclusive, much more detailed and comprehensive. The works of these critics, according to Ahmad, open a way to theorize about Indian literature. Based on the works of these critics, abstract generalizations in literature, the basic theorization in literature is possible. Their work is more empirical. It means it is based on real facts, material conditions. They take into account the material situations and bring out a history on the basis of which literary theorization can be done. In the following lines, visible on your screen now, Ahmad says that it is in comparison to these histories by these Marxist critics that the current mainstream literary history about India appears to be so underdeveloped, especially when it comes to the theorization part. So he says when we take a look at these Marxist critics' history and when we take at the earlier history mainstream history written by mainstream historians, it is then that we realize that the earlier histories are so underdeveloped. In the next section, visible on your screens now, Ahmad concludes by saying that he does not want to design a theoretical approach to Indian literature and history. All right, he is not forming a theoretical way of approaching Indian literature or history. He believes that we are still very far from that point where we would be able to do that. Okay, so he does not want to devise an approach or examine the existing approaches to Indian literature. He says he simply wants to point some areas, some gaps in the definitive category called Indian literature, which he finds problematic. That's the whole crux of the essay actually. He just points the problems in defining a category called Indian literature. So let's conclude this video with a quick recap of the main points. In this section, Ahmad states, number 1, the theoretical category of third world literature is full of gaps. It has a cavalier way with history. It homogenizes diverse works. It considers all works coming from the third world as driven with nationalism only. It considers that there is no other mediating term between the third world and the first world except exile. All right. Second, he thinks that huddling together of all adjacent but discrete histories of diverse literatures cannot be called a fixed category. In order to be a part of a particular category, the texts should justify as shaped by the culture and in turn shaping the culture. Next, he says periodization should rest on shifts more fundamental than mere chronology. Periodization should also include the examination of why certain genres flourished while others did not. He says what is being passed as Indian literature has been chosen with very uneven bias. Some texts, languages, stories were ignored in favor of high literature of the Brahminical kind. Finally, he gives hope that it is possible to speak of an Indian history which is not simplistic. According to him, many Marxist historians have attempted such histories and have been successful at it. Such histories can serve as a starting point to begin theoretical generalization about an Indian literature. So with this, I conclude this video. I hope this helped. I'll be coming with a second part really soon. Let me know if you want me to change anything about this way, this manner of teaching in the next video. Also, if you need this video in Hindi, please write in the comment section. I'm totally up for it if you need it. If this video helped you, kindly consider subscribing and sharing it with your friends. Thank you so much. Have a great day.